Hello, technology enthusiasts, and welcome to another edition of Scaling Your Business with Technology. And the reason we do this is because technology projects are not always straightforward, but they should be more simple. And my goal is to help walk you through the technology implementations hand in hand, give you some tips, advice to help you help your projects go smoother. And today we're talking about storytelling with data because this is something I've worked on for many years. I've always admired really good storytellers. I've always admired being able to articulate complex situations in a way that captures attention and inspires action. So I've been doing a lot of work on this, a lot of research on this, and a lot of practice as well. And today I wanted to share this with you, wanted to give you the opportunity to try some of these tips and tricks as well. So I'm going to share a subset of a bigger presentation and workshop that I actually do. And I'm going to show you some key tips on how you frame your story using your data. And so let's jump into some of the slides here. And again, feel free to to pop your questions in the chat. Got a couple of questions coming in advance, and I'm going to answer those. One of the question was, how do you frame your story? Where do you start? I'm going to cover a specific framework technique for that. And the other one was around the complexity of data. How do you deal with the difficult data quality? So I'm also going to cover that as well. And like I said, this has been a personal journey for me as well, both when I was working for an insurance company in the UK and working for a number of energy companies, manufacturing companies in North America. Every company has the same sort of challenges around data. So the key thing is, A, how do you get good quality data? And then how do you present it in a way that gets attention and gets your message across? So let's jump into it. So as I mentioned, the whole goal, my goal today is to help you turn your data into compelling insights that inspire action. And more importantly, it's going to help grow your careers. At the end of the day, this is going to help you learn, grow, and do things in a new way. And to do that, we're just going to do a bit of reset first because data is difficult to present. At the end of the day, when you're dealing with spreadsheets or ERP data or HR data, finance data, it doesn't matter what data it is difficult to present. And quite frankly, it's not your fault. It's because it's so difficult, we work really hard to present that data and we struggle with it. We work really hard on the presentations. We're always trying to come up with that really good graphics and really good presentation style. But then sometimes you find that you're hearing the same questions over and over again, or maybe your insights are just falling on deaf ears. You're not getting your messages across. And sometimes people just don't trust your data. And this is a real problem. And that's why I wanted to break it down for myself, but also share this with you folks as well on how do you convey your messages and your data in a way that captures attention, in a way that connects, persuades, and ultimately break through all that clutter. How do you do it in a succinct way? Because if you do this well, you'll get people to take notice. But more importantly, it's going to give you executive presence. So imagine that. It helps you boost your career by giving you more executive presence. And all my research always points back to storytelling. I think we all know that storytelling is the good way to do it, because we have to remember that data doesn't change a behavior. Stories do. I'm going to say that again because it's important. You might want to write this down. Data doesn't change behavior. Stories do, because they have an emotional connection. So let's just unpack that a little bit more. So when we think about stories to tell, stories are awesome because effectively they're invisible selling. They're getting your messages across. You hear things, you listen to things, you get emotionally involved, you get engaged with stories. Who doesn't love a good story? And if you don't, people will fill in the gaps. So you have to build your data into a story. And the reason they're so important as stories is because they originate all the way back from humankind, way back to caveman days, where sitting around the campfire, the elders would warn their children of danger by telling stories of the beasts in the dark or the wild animals that they need to be aware of. So they tell stories to get that message across, because that engages the kids, and that ultimately saves them from danger. And I always remember, I don't know if you folks have old wives' tales, I used to call them in the UK, which is probably similar here as well in North America, is where my grandma would tell me fables or stories to help warn me of danger when I was a young lad. And I always remember the one she told me about chewing gum. If you swallowed chewing gum, it would wrap around your insides and your intestines, and you would die. So don't ever swallow chewing gum. It was one of the old wives' tales that I was told. I never swallowed chewing gum, but I've also not heard of anyone dying from swallowing chewing gum. But the point is, it's a story. It creates emotional impact. I still remember it to this day, 40 years later. And that's the point of stories. So we want to use that in business because we get very serious in business. As soon as we get into data, we go into professional mode, we go into executive mode, we go into serious mode. And again, I've had to learn this over the years as well, that introducing a bit of fun sometimes helps a lot, or even just being a bit more lighthearted around how we present data. We don't have to be always that serious, even if sometimes the message is serious. We need to have that section be serious, but then we just need to present it in a way that comes across well. So sometimes by creating a different tone, we'll actually have that message come across better. So wouldn't it be much better if we present with stories? Yes. So adding stories to presentation, there's actually science behind this as well. So in a recent study, it said that 63% of managers will remember stories, but only 5% of managers will remember a single chart. So just let that sink in. Most managers will remember your presentation if it's presented as a story. If it's presented as charts, they'll easily forget it because we see charts all day. So that's the way we present. That's why stories are so important. But you have to present your stories in the right way. And to start, this is going to be we're leading up to the first framework here, folks. You have to present your stories in a way that has a drive or a plot, a problem to solve, a story point. And because when we dive into presentations, I see two key mistakes over and over again. So you want to take note of this because this happens so many times, and I'm guilty of this myself. So the two key mistakes are: one, we start with the data because we've got so much amazing data. We want to start with that. And then number two, it's all about us. It's all about what we think the audience needs to hear, what we think the message is. So those are the two key mistakes when we start with storytelling with data that we need to correct. And here's how to do it. Because we'll start with data. Because if you start with the data, there's a risk. And I love this chart, which I'm going to show you, because sometimes if you start with the data, you end up solving a problem that doesn't exist. So here's a great example. This chart always makes me smile because it's actually a correlation between ice cream sales and violent crime, of all things. What you'll see here is a very clear correlation. There's actually no causation. If you want to get into the science behind this, there's no actual direct link between ice cream sales and violent crime. But when you map the data on the same chart, it actually shows very clear correlation. And this is why we have to be careful, because we have great data. Why wouldn't we just put it into a chart and show it, then see this correlation and go, great, that must be insights? And it's not, because we're solving the wrong problem. No one cares about the fact that ice cream sales is linked to violent crime. So how do you get to the root cause of the problem? How do I identify that problem? And this is, if there's one key takeaway you need to remember from this, is always start with a clear understanding of the problem. And here's a real simple way to start that. I love the Ishikawa or fishbone diagram. This is a great technique for helping identify the true problem that you need to work on. So, for example, once you have a problem, you then break it down into specific areas. So people, process, the technology, environmental factors, external factors, drivers such as cost or budget, or maybe even the data itself, the data quality. Point is, you can actually pick any number of factors to work through, but you need to work through each of those factors one by one, taking them in isolation and working through them. And this is really, really important and really helps you understand the problem, because it helped me when I was working for a manufacturing company not so long ago. The problem statement was that manufacturing costs were increasing 10% every year, and we didn't know why. So I was asked to come in and help and understand why these costs were increasing. And they told me the problem. They said our material costs are going up. Every year they increase the cost of materials. So that's why it's costing 10%. I said, okay, that's good to know, but let's truly understand that. So I applied this Ishikawa fishbone diagram to the problem statement of material costs going up by 10%. And then we worked through the people, the process, the technology, the drivers, external environment and costs, and also the data itself, the data quality. And we worked through a number of things. There were some gaps in the data quality when we looked at the data. There were some gaps in the technology about how quick, how up-to-date the data was in terms of reporting on the costs of materials. But the real insight came from the people and process. So when we spoke to the people involved in purchasing the materials, we then found out that when we bought the materials, we had to bring on additional contractors to deal with the peaks in demand for production. But bringing in contractors was actually taking 2 months. It was taking way longer than we expected. We were supposed to be onboarding people within 2 weeks. But what was happening is that it was taking 2 months due to various approval processes and internal processes for making sure all the background checks were checked out. So as a result, the process for onboarding was broken. That was delaying the production, which was ultimately increasing the overall cost to the company because we couldn't ship the products out quick enough. Customers were complaining, people were canceling orders. As a result, it all boiled up to the 10% increase in costs. It wasn't just the materials. In fact, it was the material cost was actually a minor factor in the scheme of things. What the real problem was the onboarding process. The point here is I would have never have got to that if I hadn't have broke down the problem, if I hadn't assumed, if I didn't assume the initial problem was the problem, if I really understood it by breaking it down in this framework. So this, again, really good technique for just really understanding that problem, to take a beat before you start on the work, just to say, okay, what problem are we solving here? Is everyone clear on exactly the problem to be solved? And then once you have that problem to be solved, then we're going to move on to how to frame it in the right way. Remember that second mistake around making sure it's all about you. Okay, so this is how you make it about your audience, about the people hearing your message. And this is where I'm going to introduce you to the second technique that is really important to storytelling, which is the story framing framework. So this is a really good formula for structuring how you frame your story and if you don't know where to start, this is the formula to help you. So the formula is it starts with your client, your customer, your audience, who you're presenting to. And I don't just mean the name or the role. It's really understand what they're looking for, really understand their challenges, think about their day-to-day work and what they do or day-to-day experience, really understand your client, your audience. Then you state the problem, which we just covered in terms of the actual problem to be solved. We add the result. What do they want to see differently? What do they want to see changed? And then that's your story to tell. So to put it all together, we have, as a client or a customer, we want to solve a problem so that we achieve a result. That's your headline. That's going to be your overall selling point, your story. When you're building a presentation, it helps you build out everything around it. That's where you start. So we've started with the problem before. Now we understand the client, then we come up with the result. So as an example, going back to that manufacturing client I just mentioned, as the operations director and also the finance controller, we wanted to streamline our onboarding process so that we could reduce our production costs by 10%. So that's how we structure it in terms of the role, which is the operations director and finance manager, solve a problem, which is streamline our onboarding process so that we can achieve a result of reducing costs by 10% every year. That was our headline. That was our story formula. And from there, I use that to then build out the presentation and the data behind it. And there's a lot more detail to go into in terms of how we present our data, particularly around different charts to use, and how you present your insights with some techniques around you starting with the insight, then presenting your data, and then finishing with your insight. And I'll happily go into that in more detail in another session. Or if you have questions, reach out. I'm always here to help and go into much more detail. So much to cover here. It's a lot of great insights, but I wanted to give you the key tips that you could start using today. However, word of warning, folks, and this is really, really important. Without good data, your stories are not going to be good either. So if we want to summarize this in a different way, good data in means brilliant stories out. And I'll repeat that because it's important. Good data in means brilliant stories out. Because without that good data and without that good problem statement, you're not going to have a good story. You may have a story framing formula, but it needs to be backed up with really good quality data. And this is where, once we have our stories, we then need to look at where the data is coming from. So there's a couple of ways we need to look at this, because imagine if you were one of the clients you're presenting to, maybe it's your manager, director, maybe it's one of your customers you're sharing a new product solution for. If you want to get a handle on the key features, maybe where profit's coming from, where the costs are coming from, where revenue's coming from, maybe it's just workforce planning, your headcount. If you can't answer those questions, then how can you make informed decisions and how can you create those stories? And ultimately, you're not going to be able to better adapt to market conditions as well, because knowing the data about your market and your business is absolutely fundamental to the stories and decisions you make about the company and your team going forward. So there's 3 key points you need to remember. The first one is know your data. So we have a story to tell, that story framing framework. We know the problem. Where is the data coming from? How good? What is it like? Where is it? How accessible is it? So you need to understand how you get hold of it. Who's the custodian of that data? So know the data you need to solve the problem. Don't just collect all the data. Collect the data you need. And if you don't have it, you might have to go out and get that data. For our onboarding process, as I mentioned in that example, we didn't have good data around how long it took once the offer had been accepted to them landing on site. We heard it took 2 months in total, but we didn't know exactly why it took 2 months. And that's where we had to drill into exactly the approval process. So once getting the laptop and getting their access cards, those two in themselves were taking way longer than expected because they would get stuck in the approval process. So know your data. So getting that enabled us to then really pinpoint the streamlining of that onboarding. And then secondly, you need to organize your data. And again, I can't stress, this is probably the most important out of the 3, because once you have your data that you did, point number 1, you know the data that you want to get, you have to organize it in a way that makes sure you can get at it, get a report on it, structure it in a way that makes sense. So this is where you're building out or the right access controls. If you're storing in a system, maybe you're consolidating data. And then also you need to get access to the data through perhaps reporting tools. It could be consolidating it into a simpler tool as Excel, but it also could be consolidating into a data lake or maybe a data visualization, virtualization environments. Again, you've got to be able to pull that data together to ultimately feed up to your story that you're going to tell, because your story is nothing without the data to back it up. And then finally, trust in your data. So once you know your data, once you can get access to it and know where it is and how you're getting it presented, you've got to know you've got to trust the data. And this is probably the hardest of the 3 to do, because it assumes a lot of pre-work has gone into it. A lot of work and support around the data has already happened. So, for example, you need to know that your data is transparent. You know what the data is, where it came from, how did you source the data? Have you got the right permissions to use the data? Is it secure? Is it protected from being tampered with and altered? Even if it's just unintentional, sometimes different groups have access to data and will go in and change data because they think it's the right thing to do. But you need to make sure that it's controlled. The access controls are there. The good governance as well. Is it kept up to date? Is it tagged? Is it categorized? Is it dated? Is the metadata all correct? And then the cleansing process as well. If you find data errors, what's the process for getting it cleaned? Is it checked on a regular basis? So again, we've talked about storytelling, which is very, very important. But without the good data in, your stories won't come out well. So you need to have those brilliant stories. You need to have good data in the first place. So that's what I wanted to share with you today, is around that root cause analysis, the Ishikawa fishbone, to really drill down your problem so you understand the problem to be solved. Then get into that story framing framework, how you actually put it all together into that summary to come up with that story to tell, basing it on your audience or your client, the problem, and then the result. And then the third key point is around making sure you have that good data, making sure you have that good foundation to be able to make the business decisions and ultimately build good stories. So that was the tips I wanted to share today on storytelling for data, which ultimately will hopefully help you turn your data into compelling insights that inspire action. And what I'm going to do now is just check on their chat. I think we've covered everything in terms of the questions. Yep. So we talked about the data quality, talked about where to start with that story framing framework. And yep, I think we're good to go. So just to wrap this up again, thank you for joining. It's always a pleasure to share these tips, and glad that you get value from it. Keep the comments coming in because that helps me build better sessions going forward. I do read all your comments, and that's helping me create topics for the next sessions. So as always, we're a special group of technology project enthusiasts, and I'm here cheering you on. So as we continue to push, grow, and scale with technology, we can all make a difference, and we'll see you in the next session.